I want to welcome our audience here in the FedEx Global Education Center and to those watching us on live stream here this afternoon. But I'm Chancellor Kevin Guskowitz, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Abbey Speaker Series event, Bridging the Rural-Urban Divide. And we're grateful to have with us this evening Nancy and Doug Abbey, and for their generous support of this event and for the entire series of important, timely conversations that we're holding here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, showing our commitment to rigorous and open debate. When they made their gift to the program for public discourse, the Abbeys said that open dialogue fosters more sophisticated, thoughtful, reasoned, and successful resolutions to complex problems. And I know that's exactly what we're going to see and hear this evening. I was in Washington last week for a meeting of the Association of American Universities and talking with about 55, 60 other university presidents and chancellors around the country. And one of the main themes of that meeting was to talk about what it is that universities owe to democracy and to healthy public debate. And I heard deep concern about whether higher education is fulfilling its role in our democracy and whether we're fostering the kind of civic culture that a vast and diverse country needs as we prepare our students to go out to be the next generation of leaders and thought leaders. I often talk about the importance of this program as being a program that teaches our students how to think rather than what to think. We heard findings from other AAU opinion polls at that meeting on what the public thinks of universities and their role. And I'm glad to report that the strong majority think that we're doing a good job at research. Strong majorities think that we're doing a good job at teaching and preparing that next generation for careers. And I know that here in Chapel Hill, we are riding above the curve for sure because of a program like this that the Abbeys are committed to. And I want to thank you again. At the nation's first public university, Carolina has a heightened responsibility to get this right, as I often say. And to be the leading global public research university in the nation, we have to take on the big issues, such as the issues we're going to talk about tonight. And it's not a coincidence that this university was chartered at the same moment that North Carolina was ratifying the U.S. Constitution. From our earliest days, state leaders understood that education and democracy are intertwined and that they depend on each other. And standing for democracy means building a Carolina community that reflects the true diversity of our state, from the small towns to sprawling suburbs and every winding road in between. And so tonight's panel will discuss these issues, and that's gotten harder in an era of deepening divisions, economic, political, and cultural, between the urban and rural regions of our country. Has geography become destiny? Does the world look fundamentally different if you're standing in Charlotte or Cherryville, Raleigh or Rocky Mount? Can a public institution like ours truly serve all of North Carolina? And I know we can, and we must. Our new Carolina Cross 100 initiative, led by Anita Brown Graham in the School of Government, will strengthen Carolina's service across the state to address the impact of COVID-19. Our Tar Heel Bus Tour, which introduces faculty from all over the world to the North Carolinians who support this great university and who live in the towns that our students call home, is another example of the great work of our faculty, staff, and students as we go out across the state. And our admissions outreach makes clear that every driven, talented Tar Heel from Murphy to Manio can find a warm welcoming here in Chapel Hill. So to introduce tonight's panel, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Sarah Trull, the Program for Public Discourse Faculty Director, and Bowman and Gordon Gray, Term Professor of Political Science. And I want to again thank you all for joining us this evening. And I want to thank Sarah Trull for incredible leadership of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Guskowitz. As the faculty director for the program for public discourse, I also want to thank Nancy and Doug Abbey for making tonight's event possible. The Abbey Speaker Series is instrumental to our program's mission of modeling constructive public discourse, and I'm thrilled to finally be hosting an Abbey Speaker Series event here in person. For tonight's discussion on bridging the urban-rural divide, we have brought together panelists who not only seek to understand the increasingly polarized political culture, but also who have experience bridging economic, cultural, and religious divides. Samar Ali, right here, co-chair of the Project of Unity and American Democracy and a research professor of law and political science at Vanderbilt University. Originally from the small town of Waverly, Tennessee, Ali's career in international relations and law has bridged partisan divides. She served as a White House fellow for the Obama administration and then came back to Tennessee to join the administration of Republican Governor Bill Haslam. Ali's current research focuses on how to achieve positive compromise through promoting conflict resolution best practices among people, communities, and nations experiencing polarization. She's also president and CEO of Millions of Conversations, a nonprofit organization that aims to unite Americans around common values for a shared future. Chris Sarnati has a rather unusual biography. After receiving a PhD in physics from Johns Hopkins University, Sarnati worked on Wall Street for 20 years as a bond trader before exiting the industry in 2012 to focus on photojournalism. His subjects are people who live in high poverty communities, such as Hunts Point in the Bronx, places typically ignored by his former colleagues on Wall Street. Sarnati's book, Dignity, Seeking Respect in Back Row America, explores poverty and addiction throughout the United States and the divide between the country's upwardly mobile front row and those who lack the necessary credentials and advantages of that group. Elizabeth Corey is the Honors Program Director and Associate Professor of Political Science at Baylor University, where she teaches courses in political science and also the great texts in the university's interdisciplinary core. She regularly writes for First Things, a journal published by the Institute on Religion and Public Life. She has also published in The Atlantic, the Chronicle of Higher Education, National Affairs, and the Wall Street Journal. Some of her recent articles deal with the meaning of civility and its necessity in times of political polarization. And certainly last but not least, Mark Hetherington is the Raymond H. Dawson Distinguished Bicentennial Chair in Political Science here at UNC-Chapel Hill, my friend and colleague. His focus is on the American electorate and the polarization of public opinion. His most recent book, Prius, or Pickup, How the Answers to 4 Simple Questions Explain America's Great Divide, co-written with fellow UNC faculty member Jonathan Weiler, explores the psychological aspects of the United States deadlocked politics. I think you will find tonight's conversation insightful and also inspirational. Thank you so much for joining us. Now I'll turn it over to Mark.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for the wonderful introductions. I also want to thank the Abbey family for their generous support of this program. It's a very exciting evening, and I'm going to do my best as moderator to get out of the way for these 3 distinguished panelists. I do want to say to those who are watching online to use the Q&A function during the course of the lead up to our question and answer session, which will start at about 6:20 or 6:30 or so. And those questions will be curated by the people who are behind me today. All right, so with the idea in mind that I'm going to get out of the way as quickly as possible, let me give a little preface about my understanding of the rural-urban divide as somebody who comes from central Pennsylvania. And I grew up in Pennsylvania, steeped in the traditions of Pennsylvania politics, and have a really, I think, acute sense of what the urban-rural divide has been and what it's become. So back in 1986, the Pennsylvania governor's race took place, and who would become a famous political consultant, James Carville, ran the campaign for Bob Casey, who was the Democratic candidate for governor that year. Casey ended up winning a very close election. And what Carville did is he put to lie the notion that we have red states and blue states, but rather red areas and blue areas. The way he put it was this. When he was talking about Pennsylvania. It's Philadelphia in the east, Pittsburgh in the west, and Alabama in between. And as somebody who's from the in-between, I think that I buy that because the woman I married is from Alabama. So He, of course, was talking about the importance of the urban-rural divide 35 years ago, a divide that seems even more germane to politics now than it was then. Now, each of the panelists who are with us today have done work that provides them with a different window on sometimes the differences, but also the similarities that exist in places depending upon population density. So what I want to do at the beginning is just provide each of them an opportunity to spend a few minutes laying out what they think are the one or at most two especially important elements of the rural-urban divide that we need to account for as we begin our discussion this evening.
You go first.
Samar, would you like to go first?
Sure. So the 2 to 3 things that that we've, one or two things that are driving the discussion today. I think framing is very important. I think words and rhetoric is very important. So a lot of times, even when you call it a divide, it reinforces the division. And so I think that we should actually start with what we have in common while not ignoring the fact that we do need to address why people are in the back row, and too many people are in the back row. And just by way of background, as was mentioned, I'm really living this almost every day right now because I'm from Waverly, Tennessee, a small town of about 4,100 people. And I happened to be there when the flood happened in August. And it was one of the scariest moments of my life. And we've been working to rebuild that town, and it's really dependent on city resources. And also resources coming from Washington, D.C. And so there's this engagement that's needed, and access and communication that's needed, and trust that's required in order to rebuild and to help build this town that is really bringing a light to how that hasn't happened in such a long time. You know, and so I think that part of this is actually thinking about how we can build access, about how we can build trust, about how we can, I'll give you a very quick example. Some people, the different funds that are available, people will say, well, that's available for the city of Nashville, or that's available for this county. It doesn't go beyond that. And so that's reinforcing that divide rather than saying, actually, these are our neighbors. Yes, they are an hour and a half down the road in a rural area I've never been to, but they're our neighbors, they're our community, they're our people, we care about them, and we're all in this together. And I think that framing of it is going to allow, going back to the point that the chancellor made about as a democracy, that's going to allow for people to connect into what it means to belong in America today, what it means to belong in our democracy.
Thanks, Samar. Chris, why don't you pick up from there?
I'm going to be a little less positive. Sorry. I mean, I think there's some huge differences. And one of the things that my book is for is I mean, I spend as much time in poor neighborhoods and cities as I have in poor neighborhoods in the rural counties. And while the poor neighborhoods have some similarities, I think cities are more defined by what we have here, what we kind of see here, which is an intelligentsia, kind of an academic elite, as you were, that kind of sets the tone for someplace like New York City, even though New York City has a lot of people who are very similar in mentality to someone you might find in small town America. And that tone, that difference, I think, between what I would call basically, you know, the front row and the back row, but we can call it a rural and urban because they map pretty heavily onto each other, is two things that I think are very fundamental, how we view the world differently. One is I call it basically a transience. You know, people who live in New York City, people who live in Washington, D.C., don't really view themselves as being defined by their place. Now, obviously people from New York City, if you know someone from New York City, you know they'll let you know they're from New York City and how much better they are because of it, but it's not core to who they are. Like if you say, hey, we got a job opportunity for you, a career advancement, they'll pick up and they'll move. Because careerism is, you know, place is secondary to careerism. And that's very different from smaller towns in America. I was just in Florence, South Carolina. I was telling you the story earlier. I just literally, my thing now is to walk across cities. So I walked across Florence, and I went into the old African-American community, and I ran into a gentleman there. He was in the only real house that was functional on the block. And he was probably 65 years old. And he had spent 30 years in the military. So yes, he did leave his town, but when given the opportunity, he immediately came back because he was taking care of his 97-year-old mother. And he was also going to make sure he raised his nephews and nieces in the place he was from. So he did move, but he never really left where he came from. And place is a central part of his identity. It's a form of meaning to him. And I think that's very important because those forms of meaning, almost a transcendent form of meaning, is kind of something we in the cities, and certainly sometimes in academics, tend to think about not really having much value. We kind of just, when we think about building policy, we think, well, people can just move. A new factory, just move. Well, that's basically someone from a small town in Alabama, someone from a small town in Mississippi, someone from a small town in Michigan. That's kind of ripping away who they are. You just can't move without really giving up a lot. And the second thing I would say is how, it's going to sound a little bit, it's a big word, but how we adjudicate truth, how we think about what is right and what is wrong. If someone here, and what we teach in the universities and what I teach my kids, and what basically you learn in a big city is if you have a problem, you run to the library and you figure out how to solve that problem. You go to the experts. You build up this accumulated knowledge. You go to books, you read books, you go to the expert class. In smaller towns, and this is also true in parts of big cities, you adjudicate truth by common sense and by asking friends. You use your experience set to figure out what you run to your priest, you run to your neighbor, you use your work experience. How you think about truth is very much informed by your experience set. And so I think those two things are hard for us to overcome. And I think for us to get closer as a nation, we need to understand them. And I think once we understand them, we can overcome bridge those gaps. So I think we need to know those gaps exist. Because certainly as this country has given the way things are, social media and all these other things, I think in some senses, people are much more aware of the differences than they used to be in the past.
Thank you, Chris. And to Elizabeth.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And also thanks to the Abbeys for allowing this to take place. When I was asked to be on this panel, I initially said, I would love to, but I don't consider myself an expert in the rural-urban divide. But then I started to think about my own experience and realized that in a certain way, I come from Baylor University in Waco, Texas, which is right smack in the middle of the state. And actually, it's always been an interesting thing for me to visit the coasts because it's my sense that on the coasts, people are much more sort of set in cities or really out in the country. But where I am, you go to the grocery store and everybody from the country is going to the same grocery store you are. And there's very much a mixing. There's a mixing, but there's also, to be pessimistic for a moment, a divide as well. You can tell whether the people at the grocery store are from the university or whether they're from the country. There are these sort of markers of difference that we might want to talk about just in the way they dress and the way they talk and the way they comport themselves. And it's a very interesting sort of sociological experience to go to the grocery store in Waco. But the more serious things that I was pushed to think about in terms of this panel is that the urban-rural divide is one way of putting a divide, but there is also a divide, of course, on financial resources. I mean, it is not always the case that the people who are living in rural settings are there by choice. To drive from, and I'm speaking from my own experience again, to drive from Texas to Louisiana, which is where my home is, you drive through miles and miles of places where you just see trailers. And I don't think the people living in the rural settings are sort of choosing a bucolic, idyllic, wonderful life. They're there because they're financially in serious, in dire straits. So finances, of course, and I'm sure we will talk about this, or these different classes are issues that are layered upon the urban-rural divide. And the second thing I think is the educational differences. The one way of putting this might be to say, I think elite culture, in which I would include probably everybody who's listening to this panel, has a certain vision of a flourishing life. And it depends on the kinds of things that Chris mentioned, like achievement, investment in the future, investment in knowledge, being able to provide for oneself, to navigate bureaucracies really well. And I think people who don't have that kind of education, one, can't navigate those bureaucracies as well. But also, I wonder if their vision of a flourishing life is fundamentally different from the elites, which is to say career success, mobility, money in the bank, sufficient security. I think everybody wants those things to an extent, but I think elites want them a lot. And what Chris's book, which you should all read, tells us is that some of the people in these rural places find their happiness in things that are quite different, and they have to do with family and they have to do with faith. So I think for us to just sort of look at them as, from an elite perspective and say, you ought to be doing this and this and this, they'd say, no, that doesn't make us happy.
So I just want to add on that. I think there's a lot of assumptions being made. And it's so interesting because I think there's an assumption that, for example, the city is all elite. So if you just take Nashville, for example, there's a lot of divisions in Nashville. There are a lot of divides. And sometimes people are like, so how would you describe Nashville? It's a tale of three cities. It's the old Nashville, the new Nashville, and the left behind. And why are the people left behind? And then also what's really interesting is, for me, I'm a rural girl living in a city. Going back to that point on place and identity and coming from that small town. And one of the reasons as an international lawyer that I moved back to Tennessee and spend a lot of time in my small town is because that's where I feel like I belong. And that belonging and that identity, which I do think is so strong. And many people thought I was having a third life crisis when I moved back from Washington, D.C. to Tennessee as an international lawyer. And they're like, what are you doing? And I said, well, I want to see if I can if I can be close to my friends and my family and where I feel like I belong and do this work. But in Nashville too, just kind of like thinking about it is really interesting in terms of that element of it, and in how people who are living in cities still relate to their rural identity and the complexity of that. And I was also just thinking something as Chris was speaking, and that is thinking about what it would be like to write from a rural perspective about the experience being in New York City and New Yorkers, and how New Yorkers view themselves and how other people view New Yorkers too. Because it's so interesting, hearing as you're talking about going across the country and how, how New Yorkers are, and then just listening to that from my perspective of having spent time in New York, which is just so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think big cities definitely have a lot of diversity in them, and they have a lot of, and this is kind of what we can talk about later at some level, is one of the bridging of the divide is recognizing that, if you go to the east side of Buffalo, or you go to Parma, Cleveland, these working class black and white neighborhoods, what you find are people who came from Appalachia, people who immigrated north to find jobs. And they've maintained a lot of that small town feel. But I guess, to try to put it in this framework, I would say that what defines a city to me and how it differs from rural, even though you have people who are both back row, you have elites in both cases, it's kind of how the economies are structured.
Mm-hmm.
The cities, the New York City has a educated elite who produce knowledge work. And the working class people in there are there to physically serve the elite. They're there to deliver their food. They're there to drive their taxis, take care of their kids. So it's a very transactional relationship between the elite and the working class. You have very little friendships between the two. And in the rural counties, the economy is structured around producing things, around extracting resources. And there's less elites there, and the interaction between the elites and the working class is not nearly as transactional. They all work similar type jobs with the same goal. So I think in that sense, the nature of the work, the economy kind of defines part of the rural urban elite. But I think as somebody who comes somewhat from the left, talking about bridging that divide, the biggest frustration is getting the working class in both sections to recognize that they have a lot in common. And what that lot in common is that what they value is what the old rural societies used to value, which is the transcendent. What gives them meaning is faith, place, and family, and sometimes nation. Those things that you can't necessarily quantify the value of, i.e. transcendent values. And what cities tend to value, and in some cases, agribusiness and other rural businesses, they value the material. They value how much money you can make and how long is your resume. And it's trying to bridging the gap is building a coalition that recognizes that what we have in common, the working class in common, rural and urban, is those transcendent values.
Well, one thing that I think is especially interesting about this exchange, and it reminds me as a political scientist who studies the psychology of ordinary people, is how easy and quickly we tend to categorize. We automatically do this. It's why? Because we're human beings, and that's what human beings do. We categorize. So even in framing the discussion, my using the word divide is an example of that type of categorization. It's as natural as the day is long. So this is something that we experience and have to deal with, have to get over. But part of the issue I think that we run into is the way, people in more rural areas categorize, folks who are from more urbane or urban areas and vice versa. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to say a couple of different things that are going to make, on the one hand, liberals a little uncomfortable, and then I'm going to follow it with something that is going to make conservatives a little uncomfortable. And I want the panelists maybe to think a little bit about, with these stereotypes, these classifications that we have in our minds between the two different types of places, what can we do? Okay, so liberals won't like this much. Urbanites look down their nose at rural people. They tend to see them as uncultured rubes. They call the parts of the country they live in flyover country because rural people don't use the most up-to-date language like Latinx, people of color, LGBTQ+, et cetera. Urbanites reflexively think rural people are bigots. When it comes to matters of race and culture, urbanites tend towards the self-righteous. Conservatives won't like this. Rural people say they venerate traditions and customs because they have stood the test of time. Yet time reveals that some traditions and customs have systematically discriminated against a range of different people, women, racial minorities, LGBTQ people, et cetera. When it comes to matters of race and culture, then, traditionalism serves as a stalking horse for discriminatory beliefs, or at least potentially so. If those are the views that one side has of the other, and I think that there's evidence to suggest that's the case, what do we do? Elizabeth, would you like to start?
Well, that's a very hard question to answer. I mean, I think your characterizations are largely right. I think, talking about tradition and traditionalism with respect to rural communities, in one sense that seems right. In another sense, one wonders how much tradition is really left there. I mean, in the sense that, as I said before, my sense is often that people are not, they would move if they could. Because, or they, Chris might disagree with me on this, they would move if they could for better economic prospects. They don't want to move at the same time because their life is probably there, and they want to stay close to family. So I think what's necessary is to examine what's meant by the word tradition and traditionalism. And as is always the case when that word is used, we've got to say, well, parts of the tradition are very good and laudable, and other parts of it might need to be revised or changed. And so to say that rural people are traditional and city people are not, I think is in a way an oversimplification. I think the other point you raise about the liberals looking down on sort of flyover country. I mean, I get this all the time living in Texas because people love to mock Texas, sometimes for good reason, we deserve it, but not always. And there's a notion that sort of the important things are happening on the coast, and anyone who would choose to live in a place that's not at the center of things is a rube, or why would you do that when you could live in the sort of places that are elite. So I think there's truth in both those stereotypes, and I don't know really how to adjudicate it, but I think that's certainly a tension there.
Any thoughts, Chris?
That's a hard question. I guess what I'd say is, kind of the divide in some senses is almost harmless. And generally, it's kind of, look, I mean, the city mouse, country mouse has been told forever. I mean, it's like, it's because it's there. It's the divide. But when it becomes a problem is when one side is seen as getting ahead at the expense of the other. That's when the divide actually becomes political, and that's when it becomes ugly. And I think I'll kind of reveal my on whose side I'm on hand here, in the sense that to the degree I have a side is that I think the last 40 years, you go back 40 years, and that economy I was talking about was, you extract stuff from the rural economy, and you ship it off to the cities where they make stuff, and then they add value, and then it's a win-win. Everybody wins. I think over the last 40 or 50 years, it's becoming harder and harder to see what the cities make. Other than just, when they made automobiles, everybody could understand this was win-win, but now they're making leveraged CDOs, and people are like, what's that? That's a reverse income mortgage that, that screwed me over. So I think, and you can just see an income gap, the cities are winning. You can easily paint the narrative that the cities are extracting from the rural communities. And so in that sense, the stereotypes start mattering, because now what is clearly differences, and there are differences, I mean, we have to acknowledge there are differences. Now one side sees those differences and can turn them into ugly stereotypes to use in a political battle. And I don't think that political battle happens. I think it's all kind of innocent, haha, you're this, haha, I'm that, let's go get a beer together, until one side starts winning and the other starts losing. I think that's the problem we have to address.
Or if we're so close to tied, as we are in terms of winners and losers politically these days, it might up the ante a little bit as well. But Samar, this is really in your wheelhouse of things, the type of work that you've done with A Million Conversations. You probably have some window on the degree to which contact with each other might make some sort of difference in overcoming, what of course we've identified as these, sort of stereotype views of what the other is like.
I think it's a complex problem that requires a complex solution. And so there's not a silver bullet answer, and that annoys people a lot of times. But it's as you were saying, country mouse, city mouses, but this has been happening for a long time. This isn't just suddenly in the 21st century we're struggling with this problem. And here we are. And I think that also there's this tension. Well, not a tension. There's a scarcity mentality. That there's a lot that is creating and a lot of fear against the other, and that is even reinforcing these stereotypes. And I think that if we can shift gears, and I'm not saying it's easy to do this either, but if there can be an intentional shifting of gears towards a growth mindset, then I think that it can help to in people's minds, think about the differences differently and give possibility and hope. And I think hope is a very important emotion. And so I'm a mediator by trade now. And so I mediate conflicts and divisions and et cetera. And so I think on that, from what conflict resolutions practitioners would say, based on experience in dealing with societies that are divided, is that hope is key, and but you have to do even more than that. You can't just run around saying hope all the time. That you have to really think about, what do you want to be together? What do you want to aspire to? And to help for people to move into a vision of what they can be together while remaining true to who they are in that individual sense that gets to that belonging piece. And then, and naturally what then happens is once there's a commitment to a shared future that includes each other, despite those stereotypes, while recognizing what your common values are going to be, and I would argue equality being one of them as a pillar of our democracy this century, what you will then find is people will need to talk about their experience with the truth today and what their fears are and what they want to make sure doesn't happen that has happened, and a reconciliation with that. And that's a process. And so I think when I hear these I've been called everything you can imagine. And I think like on that, it's just to say, it's not, I'm not saying it's okay, but I will say like stereotypes unfortunately exist. And there is assumptions that are made that we make about each other in conversation of when words that people are using or where you're trying to figure out where they are when you're first meeting somebody and you're making all kinds of assumptions. And I think though that people are complex. And so yes, it does start with talking to each other, but you can't have, you can't meet everybody. And I think it's easier to do that in a small town, but it's harder to do that in a city. And so in media and the fourth industrial revolution has changed how we've connected, how we communicate, and how we see each other, and how, and in the digital space, and COVID has exacerbated that as well. So we do have to be thinking about our online communities too, and how we relate, and how algorithms work too, as well. And just, and how our election cycle is, and identity politics is also adding to how we relate to each other, how we see each other, how we otherize each other, dare I say it, how we demonize and dehumanize each other. So when we have dehumanized, and the otherization process, which stereotyping does very well, leads us down that road to negative norm setting cycles of fear, anger, hate, violence. So to disrupt those negative norm setting cycles and to set down a positive norm setting path, where the first thing we have to do is address the otherization problem. And that starts with talking about and understanding and being realistic about what are the stereotypes today and how are they being used and what are they being used for.
Can I follow on that?
Absolutely, please.
Yeah, it does seem like you're really talking about something very important, which is the stereotyping of other people. And it almost seems like we've got to somehow recognize that we do that. We don't do it in ways that are politically unacceptable now, but I think we still do it along the urban-rural divide a lot. I actually had a conversation years ago with a friend. She is very progressive, and she said something along the lines of, we live in a city neighborhood, and my street is kind of gentrified, and the street behind us is not at all. And she said, it's a shame you have to live, with the peasants behind you. And that was okay. That was a kind of prejudice that was just fine from her perspective. But that's really not just fine, because these people are our moral and political equals. And it gets at this notion of American equality. If we really are seeing people who live on that street as peasants, it seems to me we're not treating them, or we're potentially not treating them as equals. And that's a huge problem, because it's okay to meet them in that way, or it seems to be okay.
And on that, so I was about 10 years ago for being interviewed for a position, and they broke the different interviewees up into geographic locations. It was for a national position, and they put me in the Los Angeles bracket. And they had an interview panel in the South. And I was like, I'm just curious why I'm in the LA panel. I mean, and they said, well, you're not really from the South. I was like, I'm sorry. And they're like, yeah. But I mean, we know all that thing and it's a cute story and all that. But you fit in more on the coast given your background. you're working at a big law firm, and it's an international law firm, and you're first generation Arab American, and just sort of based on your resume, we just thought you were more of a fit in Los Angeles.
Yeah, that does not shock me, unfortunately, the case. But here's one thing that that I really want to push you guys a little bit more on. I think we've identified, some pretty deep problems. Some we've started to talk a little bit, in sort of broad theoretical terms about solutions. But in my teaching, here at Carolina, and this is true wherever I've been, I'm just so impressed by the students and their desire to figure out a way to bridge these divides that we have. We know from the social psychology, that contact is going to be, very important. But we also know from media studies that if you put a liberal in front of Fox News or a conservative in front of MSNBC, they're going to blow up the television. So with that in mind, how do we generate the proper type of contact such that you don't have a sort of a boomerang effect in trying to bridge these types of differences? Chris.
I mean, I'll just use a simple example from this morning. I went into the Starbucks. I got up at 6 in the morning and walked over to the Starbucks, and I didn't like it because it was filled with people like me. They had laptops and political slogans. So I walked 3 blocks and went to McDonald's and had a great time there because it was filled with people with, I love Jesus hats and, and guys in Carhartts. Change up where you have coffee in the morning and, hang out there. If you read my book, you realize I started this project as an atheist, and I ended up, an atheist vegetarian, and now I go to McDonald's and go to church. And part of that was
Amazing.
I just went in whenever I went to a new town. I just went into the churches, and I attended whatever house of faith the people around me were attending. I attended, and I'm not the most conventional looking person, and I'm certainly, when I walk into an African-American community, I'm an outcast, or I'm out of sorts, but I've walked into every church I've walked in, I've been accepted in, and in some I've been asked to give sermons, which is a bit odd. But, if you attend one house of worship, go to another one. If you're an atheist, if you want to start easy, go to a Universalist church. But maybe even go to like a Hindu temple, just give it a shot. Like everybody I've never once had a house of worship not accept me, not embrace me. And I've learned a lot from that. And so, those are easy steps you can take to kind of broaden your horizons. And I think, it doesn't take much. I think the problem is, again, we're very siloed these days, and it's very easy to be siloed. And so the stereotypes ring more true the more siloed you are. It becomes this feedback loop where you read about stereotype, and then again we start owning the stereotypes. If you say I'm an out-of-touch elite, I'm going to become an out-of-touch elite just because why not? If you say I'm a clueless rube, I'll be a clueless rube because why not? And so I think get out of your comfort zone. I don't mean you don't have to do anything crazy like go way across town to a bar that's not safe, but a little slightly out of your comfort zone.
I love that answer. It reminds me actually of a experience I had in teaching my political parties class last semester. And, contact is something I'm always, sort of trying to suggest. And one of my students halfway through the term said, I was skeptical, but I asked out a person who was of the opposite political party, for me. And he, sort of paused. I said, so how did it go? And he said, oh, we're still going out. So, it's definitely, you got out of his comfort zone, in that regard. What other thoughts do you all have on this, Elizabeth?
It's interesting that Chris brought up houses of worship. I mean, it does seem to me that not that Christians always practice these virtues, but they are certainly rooted in Christian teaching, is the virtues of charity and humility. I mean, why don't you actually go to the house of the person on the street that is not a good street and meet that person, and you might find that person is really kind or very interesting, and you can have a conversation with them. So it's a kind of extend a bit of charity and be humble about the assumptions that you think you already understand everything. To come back to the point that the chancellor made in your introduction, what do universities owe to democracies? mean, there's a very optimistic view that actually universities can help here. I mean, particularly conservatives love to bash universities. I know this very well, but there is an opportunity for modeling civil discourse in classes, especially in those smaller classes with seminars. I teach an American constitutional law class, and we do not shy away from the most controversial issues. You know, we're doing race and affirmative action and abortion. And this is the kind of thing that people say, well, you shouldn't do that because people are going to be offended. And we just start out with some ground rules at the beginning. Say, look, this is an open space. Let's engage with people we may not agree with. You're free to say things that you may not fully believe, or you don't necessarily hold these positions, but be brave and say it in a civil way. And that can be, I think, a positive step forward. I think professors need to do that. And then students would come out of school thinking, oh, I don't have a bunch of enemies on the other side, but actually there was a conservative in my class that I really liked, or there was that progressive that wasn't, as crazy as I thought. I've had students say things like this, and I think initiatives like that are really helpful.
Samar, you've had a lot of experience with this.
Yeah, so I would say I think it's fun to be a visiting anthropologist, and so I highly recommend it. I think I'm using that term loosely here, but I think it's listening to Chris talk. I mean, it's just really, I think it's really it's a fun way to go through life in being exploratory and in really trying to have a lot of and connecting with people that are different than you. And having different experiences. At least for me, I don't fear that. I think it's energizing. And I think that I've talked to a lot of people that have, whenever, for example, they go to a new place, they're really excited about going and what that's going to be like, and the experience that they're going to have, and the connections that they have with people, and et cetera. And if you are seeing enemy everywhere, it's really hard to enjoy life. I'm not trying to be flippant about it, but I do want to say a friend versus enemy framework of existence is a very hard existence.
I mean, like just as an example is like, I was walking around Youngstown, Ohio. I mean, Youngstown, Ohio is famous for being, central to the 2016 election. It's, got angry Trump supporters, it's got angry Hillary supporters, and blah, blah, blah. And I walked by a mosque in Youngstown, Ohio. And I walked in, I just they're having service, and, kind of wondering how I was going to be received. And literally 4 hours later, after my fifth meal, I'm having to say, can I go now? Can I leave? Because they were just so welcoming. I mean, it's just you'll be surprised with how welcoming people are if you come in with the right spirit.
Yeah, totally. And I remember Christmas a couple of years ago, I was in my hometown, Waverly, and Christmas morning, I just got back from Switzerland. It's a long story. And I was jet lagged. And I was I'm going to go to the Baptist church. And I went, and I spent several hours there And I remember that people were surprised. And I saw my classmates that I went to school with, and my family wakes up late. People woke up, they're like, what'd you do this morning? I was I went to the Baptist church in Waverly. And they're like, what made you go do that? I was it's Christmas. It's Christmas morning. I figured it'd be good to connect with folks, and had a great time. And so, I think that surprises some people. But it was a great experience. But I do want to say that these individual experiences that we have, and to answer your question, to think back about your question, which was putting a liberal in front of a Fox News, and they'll, or a conservative in front of MSNBC. I think that's a different kind of encounter. And I think we have to think about what's happening in our everyday lives versus what media we're consuming, and what's being, and how it's, not only how we're consuming at it, but why it's being projected in the way that it is. And I think this is getting to a completely different conversation. So I don't want to get off track too much, but I am, and I have been fascinated by just the evolution of media in America, and over the past 30 years. And then kind of thinking about how we build resilient societies, and how we do that in the age of social media, and also with cable news. And and what that means for us as we have these everyday experiences.
Well, I appreciate all of this. And I'm just going to ask one more question before we go to the audience and the online audience. But I want to mess this up a little bit, muddy this up a little bit, because we're talking, some kumbaya moments here. We just got to get together. However, the nature of politics these days make doing that, sometimes a little bit difficult. So, just to use, one example, how do you encourage somebody, say, of Mexican-American descent, to go out and break bread with people who voted for somebody who wants to build a wall between the two countries, Mexico and the United States? What do you say to people who are, with some reason believe that the politicians of one side think I'm an idiot? How do you get people to embrace that step? Because on the one hand, it's a pretty difficult step to make.
Let me say one thing to that. I think one way of doing it is to say that all of life is not exhausted by politics. So that you might discover, this actually has happened to me. I have a neighbor with whom I probably shared zero political views, but her son has become best friends with my daughter, and they're both 7 and they love to play together. Okay, this is a wonderful, heartwarming story. But the point is that actually we have this connection now, which has nothing to do with politics, and it has all to do with social interaction. I think that's one way, realize, okay, yes, we do differ on politics, but politics is not the whole of life. So to the extent we can set those things aside and engage in sort of real, authentic friendships on the basis of other things, and know that she's not gonna persuade me and I'm not gonna persuade her. We both know that. Then I think those kinds of relationships can work. And I think a part of navigating this political divide is knowing where not to go. I mean, if you are the kind of person who just wants to kind of bash, again and again, this is my view, you're an idiot if you don't believe it, you're not gonna have a lot of friends, maybe even in your own party. But certainly you've got to learn that there are many things worth pursuing that are not political.
Samar, this seems to echo your thoughts about, friend versus foe thinking.
Yeah, I think for those of you who might not be familiar with my story, I've been the target of a hate campaign for almost a decade now. I've been called a terrorist, a financial jihadist. I won't go through the list. I won't go down through the list further, but it's just to say it's hard when people are engaging with me who know that to not get into politics with me and to not go there and to avoid that. And so it's like, it's territory that's hard to avoid, kind of getting to the point about a Mexican American going over to meet with somebody who wants to build a wall, and they feel that the political stance that somebody is taking is by default offensive. And so, but I will say, what has been so interesting is actually the conversations that I've had around this with people who have called me a terrorist, and at the end of the conversation want to have lunch with me. And I don't think that that's something that I'm doing that's special. I think I think that there is, inherently, you already noted I'm optimistic. Inherently, people are good and can be persuaded to be more inclusive, and I'll give you a story of just to kind of explain what I'm talking about. This has happened so many times, and I was thinking as we were talking, as you were asking the question about which one of these stories to tell, because there's so many at this point. But one story was pretty early on, after I'd been called all these things, and there was billboards out against me, and campaign ads, and radio ads, and anyway, this woman came up to me after I spoke on a panel, and she said, "Do you know who I am?" And I said, "No, I'm sorry, I don't. I guess I should." She goes, "You should recognize me. You should know who I am." I was like, I was a little embarrassed. Like, "I'm so, sorry. We met, etc." She's like, "Well, I was one of the key people that was protesting against you and calling you a terrorist in the state legislature." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And, it's like this moment. if I was just going to excuse myself and say, okay, well, there's nothing left to talk about here. But instead I said, I just looked at her and she said, but you don't look like a terrorist. You look like one of us. And she said, you don't associate yourself with those Muslims. And I said, okay, so here, I said, there's a lot going on here. And and I said, I am an American, I'm a Tennessean, and that's, yes, we are the same there. We share this identity. I'm also Muslim, so it's not about me associating myself with those Muslims. I am Muslim, and I wish you would have talked to me before as well. And this is a much longer conversation, and we should go have coffee when we both have more time. And she said, but you don't believe in that Quran and what that Quran says. And I said, I think what you've been told the Quran says and what I believe it says is different. And that's the conversation we also need to be having. And we really connected. And there was this moment to where I could see too of where she wasn't going to walk out that door and I really believe this. And she didn't, by the way, in terms of she did not remain an Islamophobe in terms of her actions of going after other Muslims and calling them terrorists. But I will say that I also am a trained mediator. And I will say that I think it's important for people to feel safe when they are in conversations. And that's where, in the point about setting the ground rules of how you're going to have difficult conversations. And that's something we do at Millions of Conversations too. And we've been asked this question a lot, that we came up with a listening facilitators guide. Actually it's a listening guide, which helps people have these difficult conversations and enter into them with friends and family so that they can have we hope for to be a positive outcome. And I'm not saying that it works every time, but I do think that it works more often than not.
Chris, it sounds very similar to the notion of getting yourself out there into, unfamiliar spaces.
Yeah, but I'll take a slightly different take and not overlooking this story. I'm going to spin apathy as a positive thing. I think a lot of Americans just don't care about politics. The largest share of voting is none of the above. No one votes, and that's actually, in that some sense, as a positive. I think these debates and
Totally.
And political figures attract political attention, but again, for the last for 6-7 years of my life, I spent driving around America, going into bars, going into churches, going to Waffle Houses. And I spent the last 3 months literally walking across parts of America. People don't care. People get along. I think the problems come from places where they don't actually experience overlap. And they kind of have this sense of it as just kind of this external boogeyman, where there's actual diversity. I was just in Indianapolis. I literally walked across Indianapolis, and there are Muslim communities. There's Buffalo. Buffalo has a large Congolese population, has a large Iraqi population. Indianapolis has a large Saudi Arabian population, actually, of resettlements, and people get along because when people are confronted on having to be good neighbors, they end up being good neighbors. But also, people just honestly, they judge each other on an individual level, and the political angle just doesn't really. Most Americans, I don't want to go into college and basically spin the honor of the non-voter, but there is something admirable in not caring, because it means you don't get caught up into all of this.
Indeed. Well, thanks so much to the panelists. We're going to, of course, now continue to engage the panelists, but from the audience's perspective, if you guys have questions that you'd like to ask, please raise your hand. I think they'll get you, someone will get you a microphone, someone, not me. And of course, the questions are being curated online by one of the people involved with the program as well. So I see a couple of hands. We have a Bears fan up front here. And then next we'll go, so first here with the Bears, second in on the right, and then third will go to you. Do we have some microphones? Or we'll just go without. Okay, so if you could just do the question, I'll try to recast it in that sense. Go ahead.
Hi, my question is about what role that those of us who have 1 foot in each camp have. I call the car and college crowd. What roles do we have to play in bridging society? Okay, so for the people who are online, the question is, for those of us who have 1 foot in each camp, what role can we play in this whole thing?
Can I ask you to clarify, do you mean 1 foot in the political, the conservative liberal camp or the rural urban? Or yeah. I think if that's you, or if it's someone you know, that person would be in an ideal position to work as a kind of mediator of sorts, because I'm thinking of your mediation work, you understand the experiences from the point of view of both the sides, and you can bring that experience to bear in any conversation. I mean, that's just sort of a quick flippant answer, but I think you're actually you're in the ideal position, and you're not inclined to ideology on either extreme.
I think to kind of elaborate on that point, to be more exacting, where people get things wrong is when they don't understand context. They hear someone did A without understanding what happened around for them to do A. And if you have a foot in both worlds, you're better able to translate.
Totally.
Because it really is 2 different languages. If what made someone do A was some complex series of that only can take place in a rural setting, you can move it to an urban setting. But I think this is what online does, it strips things of the context the actions take place in. And the context actions takes place in is almost everything.
Totally. I mean, that's kind of going back to the point that I was making earlier about Waverly and Nashville, and being a rural girl in the city. And then most recently experiencing that because of Waverly needing to be dependent a lot on resources coming from Nashville, and helping bridge that being almost like a translator between the two, and in how to even make the financial ask that's needed for this school in Waverly.
That's very interesting. Wonderful. In the back there, yeah. Yes. You can just, oh, here comes a microphone.
My question was for Samar, when you mentioned about setting up ground rules and having those difficult conversations with people that have opposing views. Do you have any examples or tips for having those conversations?
Yes, and it's on millionsofconversations.com. Take the pledge to listen, and you'll get not flooded, but you'll get a guide that walks through that process, and then there's other programming. But really, truly, dignity, that word that your book is called, is key. It really actually is key, because it focuses people on each other's humanity. And it's a commit. And so we called millions of conversations and not millions of voices as well, because we think a lot of people are on send right now, especially in the digital space. There are a lot of voices, but what's not happening as much as we need to see are conversations. And a conversation's a two-way street. It goes both ways, and it requires listening and communicating. And trust building in order to have effective conversations. So it's important in having difficult conversations to say why you're having those difficult conversations, what you hope to get out of having those difficult conversations, what you aspire to together, setting those ground rules, how you will respect each other's humanity, recognize each other's dignity. They might sound trite or whatever, but they really are going back to basics that I think help center the human mindset because I think we're learning a lot of even more about the human brain and how it's triggered and how the lizard brain works and et cetera, and how fear affects us. So I think that also knowing that you might get triggered in the conversation, and sometimes depending on what the topic is of talking about how you'll deal with that moment when you're triggered. and how well you know the person when you're having that conversation too. So there's context, going back to that context of how you're having that difficult conversation is important, and who you're having it with, what your history together is. All of those things come into play. But a lot of times if you center on just some of those key basic points that we each respect each other's humanity and see each other's dignity, that's a really good start.
Excellent. Gentleman in the white.
I think Chris might have had something to say.
Oh, I'm sorry. So you have an online question at this point, or? Yeah.
I thought I would sneak in two. So the first is to Chris. Are urban and rural McDonald's is different, and which is better? And the second, and there are a lot of questions along these lines, touching on Summer's commitment to a shared future, does this require a dedicated economic effort to bring working class manufacturing and agricultural jobs back to rural America? I imagine policy that requires the urban to rely on the rural factory towns will afford them more dignity without needing to be unrooted. And then there's generally questions about to what extent does addressing some of these problems require economic changes?
And I've probably been to literally over 1,500 McDonald's, and there is a big difference. I think the food's better in rural McDonald's, but the people watching is much better in urban McDonald's, so that would be my quick answer.
When y'all were talking about the sense of belonging, a lot of it felt like it was coming from like misinformation. So you were talking about the bigots that were talking about, that were just saying just awful things about you. And then also the like politics isn't really everything. What do you say to people who grow up in like rural America where institutions like churches have sort of taught them that parts about themselves are just wrong? Like I think specifically about LGBTQ+ community members. Like me being in that community, growing up in rural North Carolina, like that was something that was always taught to me. And then when I came into more urban areas, it was sort of expelled. Like that was sort of taught differently. What do you say to people who have that experience? Like, why should they go back and engage in those conversations when their entire like upbringing has been about that being incorrect?
That's a very powerful question. So thank you for asking it. And I'm sorry for what you've been through, for sure. And I think that I said you need to feel safe. And I think that's first and foremost. And that's a personal decision on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I get a version of this question all the time, and one of the ways I always say, you know, faith and place and family has value that we don't, and you know, there's always someone who raises their hand and goes, well, sometimes that value is negative, you know, and that's true. Sometimes, you know, there are people who grew up in families that abuse them. There are people who grew up in churches that abuse them. There are people who grow up in places that abuse them, and you know, they leave. And I think there are always exceptions to the rule. There's always reasons, like, you know, I would never encourage someone to go back to a place they've been abused. I think, you know, and I guess I could only say or only hope that doesn't broaden into a worldview that doesn't recognize that not everybody does that, and not all forms of faith, and not all forms of family, not all forms of places do that. But look, I mean, you know, I'm out there advocating for faith, place, and family. But the minute I got out of my hometown, and I didn't look back. And so I understand that for many people. Now, my situation was not nearly as bad as yours in that sense. I mean, I was a math loving nerd who was surrounded by people who didn't love math or weren't nerds. So I got out. But I think, you know, there's nothing wrong with leaving, you know, and I think there's a lot to be said for the system we have now that allows people to move, and to move to big cities and find where they want to be, and find a community that's for them, and sort into the community that you know, they should be sorted into, that's healthy for them. But that doesn't mean we always have to be always doing that. And that for some people, that doesn't work.
I think it's so important to be you. And I think that that's about the belonging piece. And so when talking about what does it mean to belong in America today, I think so much of it is having the space to exist in your full being. And I think that's what freedom in many ways means, to get philosophical about it. And and so I think that taking that and applying it to who do you want to be, given what you have experienced in the community that you're in now, and how you engage with the world. And I'll give you just another quick story on this, because I had somebody similar call me, really close friend who is a scientist and came from a country that didn't treat him well at all. And now he's a famous scientist, and the ambassador of that country wanted to meet with him, and he didn't want to meet with the ambassador. And he called me and he said, I don't want to meet with the ambassador. Do I have to go? What do you think? And I said, don't go.
I mean, I guess I would say, I mean, I would never encourage anybody to go into an environment where they don't feel safe. I mean, you can make small steps, like going to McDonald's is, versus the Starbucks. But, one of the things I talk about in the book is I understand who I am and where I come from. And that it wouldn't necessarily be as easy for someone who was a Black individual to do that like I did. I will say that I spent, roughly 60% of my time in neighborhoods where I was the only white person. There was some awkward moments, but I think that if you, at least for me, if you make assumptions about how people are, if you make assumptions about how people are going to treat you, that's basically what I call, it's individual racial profiling. That if I just assume I'm unwelcome because of my skin color, that's unfair to the community that I'm walking into. And I think it's very much the case that I believe, in general. And again, I can only say what I've seen in other communities that I've been in. I've been in environments that are overwhelmingly white, where people of color walk in and are being welcomed. I think it plays out very differently in different spaces, and I think the situation isn't necessarily as bad on the ground as it is in the dialogue. But that's not to say there aren't problems. Again, I don't want to deny that there are ugly things that go down in communities.
Yeah, so I think kind of taking an international perspective on that as well, and having lived in South Africa and other places, I would say that there's a power in storytelling, and in the healing process. So, and everybody, I'm not saying that there's just one way to go through a healing process, but if you look at the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa, that was led, and we're in the Nelson Mandela Auditorium, so how perfect to use this reference. And and thinking about why Nelson Mandela asked Archbishop Tutu to lead the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and what that looked like, and the reasons behind it, and what they were trying to do, and the role of forgiveness and truth and healing in addressing trauma for societies who have decided they want to live together and move forward. It's hard. It's saying it in an auditorium like this makes it sound easy, and it's not easy. And it's also any community that's experienced trauma it's not justifiable. It's awful. I think that we also, as conflict resolutions practitioners, think a lot about the cycle and how you break that cycle. And I think part of it is coming together, and for people, again, who feel safe in creating that context and space to do so, to be able to talk about it, to be heard, and for there to be a discussion about what a pathway forward looks like, with recognizing that we never want to do that to each other again. We never want that to happen again, never again.
Can I add one last thing to that? You know, there is a notion, I mean, we've been talking a lot about safety here, and I think we have to be careful in the degree to which we extend safety. I mean, obviously physical safety is very important, but there is an element of having conversations about controversial topics that is by definition slightly disconcerting, or maybe very disconcerting. You're afraid, am I going to say something that is going to be wrong in the eyes of this person? I mean, I constantly have this battle of, should I say this, should I not say this? And I realize if I let the voice that says, well, that person might be upset if I say it, there will never be conversations. So we have to balance like a serious respect, humility in one's own views, and charity toward the other, with the idea that actually I'm allowed to say things as well, and all of you are. And so we can't let a fear of giving offense allow us never, or prohibit us from ever speaking.
We've traversed from the right side of the auditorium to the left. There are a couple of hands over here. I guess closest is the person in the green sweatshirt, closest to the microphone, that is, which is a big plus.
So I was just going to say that I feel like this conversation has been directed towards like assuming that the oppressors want to have these conversations. Like going back to the Mexican American and the Build a Wall example, like I am sure, 100% sure that a Trump supporter is not going to admit that they are wrong, and that they are going to have the conversation with the Mexican American and say, you know what, I'm sorry, I am racist. So how can you be so sure that these conversations are going to be 1, open, 2, safe, and 3, compassionate, when what we're seeing happening in the United States right now is none of those 3 things at all?
I guess one of the things I did during the 2016 election, I think some of the stereotypes here are wrong. There is a wall that goes through El Paso. On one side is Juarez, and the other side is El Paso. And I walked along the wall. I walked 5 miles along the fence. And I asked people along the wall, what did they think of the wall? And 99.9% of the people who live with a fence in their backyard are Mexican Americans. Some have been here 1 month, some have been here 30 years. All of them like the wall, and about 30% told me they like Trump. So I think, you know, the notion that Mexican Americans cannot be Trump supporters, and that these issues can't be relatively complex and people can have nuanced views, I think is kind of, you know, one that needs to be rethought. Now, that doesn't mean that some of what you asked is not right. It's just that I felt like you know, in so many ways we ask these questions in very kind of almost cartoonish ways that are meant to basically cause divisions. I think people's views on issues, once you drill down, are a lot more complex and a lot more nuanced, and sometimes, to be unfair, a lot crazier. That, you know, how do you explain that? How do you explain somebody a Mexican American who's been in this country for 6 months and doesn't want any more immigrants in? You know, people are complex.
Very complex. So it's happened so many times. So, I mean, so many times people have apologized to me. Who fit the background that you're saying.
You know, one of the things that I find most frustrating about, you know, along those lines is there's almost a irreconcilable hypocrisy in some cases, where I remember I was in a small town. To give you the opposite side, I was in a small town in I forget where it was, somewhere in Texas, and not where it was. It was Natchitoches, Louisiana. It doesn't sound like it's spelled. And then there was a Mexican American restaurant there that the entire communities would go to and have big family dinners at this Mexican American restaurant. Everybody was friendly with the owners. It was a family that had come from Juarez, I believe, and set up this wonderful Mexican restaurant. Everybody was friendly. And the minute they walked out of the restaurant, they put on their MAGA hats and started bad mouthing Mexicans. And it was just kind of jaw dropping. Like, you know, like how can you have that view and then count this family who runs this restaurant as one of your best friends? But people can hold a lot of irreconcilable differences.
Over to, so we're getting close to 7 o'clock. So I think we're probably going to need to end on the next question, which is going to come from online.
It's a lot, but the statement about valuing family doesn't seem quite accurate. Elite enclaves like university communities are filled with stable families and people who sacrifice greatly for their children. At the same time, economic deprivation and the opioid epidemic have decimated families in some rural areas. Any comments from the panel on this?
I think we have to be thinking about the systematic issues at play here and the policies and on the opioid epidemic, about thinking of, I think there's two things going on there as well. At the communal level of thinking about what does the community systematically need access to in order to address the complexities of opioid addiction, and the care that's needed, and the resources that are needed, and thinking about how to address from a, because I don't think from what I've read, like that it's just one issue. I think it's complex. And so we need to be able to design a systematic solution that rises up to addressing successfully. And we need to also decide, like, what does success look like? And are we going to be managing the opioid epidemic, or are we going to solve it?
Well, I want to thank a lot of people. I'd like to thank the Chancellor for making all of this possible, and of course the Abbey family most centrally for making all of this possible. It's been a wonderful exchange. I want to thank the panelists for their very thoughtful answers. One thing that I'm really struck by about this conversation was just the number of times people said things that I had never thought of before, and I think that's a mark of a really successful event. So again, thank you to all who are online, for the people in the audience here, and especially to the Abbey family.